Question number 8, Denis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This question is to the Minister of Transport. Is the government committed in the long term to a sustainable railway network for New Zealand?
Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Simon
Mr
Bridges.
Speaker, yes, because after years of underinvestment, this government's invested nearly $4 billion in rail and is committed to investing more as appropriate.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Denis O'Rourke.
With a 60% increase in road freight since 2000 and thousands of additional trucks expected on state highways in coming years, how will the government ensure that rail takes a much greater share of the national freight burden in the future?
The Honourable Simon
Speaker,
Bridges.
I suppose we could arrest people who don't use rail, but frankly, Mr Speaker, we're allowing these different modes to play to their strengths. And rail does have a real strength over the long haul and bulk commodities. And in fact, in the last year has seen its proportion of freight as exports go up. I think as we see more big ships, as we see more inland ports, it will continue to be able to play to the strength that it has.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Denis O'Rourke.
In addition to the 4 options in the Kiwi Rail Commercial Review 2014, the trimmed network, the separate islands network, the Upper North Island network and exit, will he request consideration of an expansion and improvement option for the whole country, and if not, why not?
The Honourable Simon Bridges.
Well, Mr Speaker, the member may not like the facts, but we've invested nearly $4 billion. That's comparable to what we've invested in the roads of national significance that he and his mates next to him, the Greens, love to hate so much. We are investing, and we continue to do so with projects that stack up.
Point of order.
Point of order.
I specifically asked whether the Minister would...
Order. The question was so long, it's very easy for the member to address any part of it. The member wants a short, sharp question. I can help him get a straight answer. Supplementary question?
The question was not long, Mr.
Order.
Mr.
Member will resume his
Speaker.
seat immediately. I have ruled. I'm giving the member a chance to complete his questioning. If he doesn't want to, we can easily move to the next one.
Point of order.
If it's a fresh point of order, I'll hear it. If it's any attempt to relitigate where I've just got to, I'll be asking the member to leave.
I'm simply asking if that question was too long.
I've dealt with that matter.
What is the appropriate
Denis
length of
O'Rourke. Denis O'Rourke will leave the chamber. I gave him an absolute clear warning. Order. The member will leave. Order. Point of order. Right, Honourable Winston.
Speaker, my colleague asked the question, if it was too long, then how would you yourself have phrased it? Now, can I just finish my point of order?
Well,
I've barely spoken a few words when you're jumping to your feet.
The member can raise a point of order in line with standing orders. I'll hear it, but he better do it succinctly.
That's precisely what I am doing. My colleague asked the question.
It is a point of order.
If the question was phrased too long...
The member will resume his seat immediately. Now, this is a point of order, and I want to hear it without any interjection from my right-hand side. Right, Honourable
Speaker, my colleague asked if the question is too long, then how would you have phrased it? I think that he was seeking some clarity, because if the question was too long, you would have ruled it out at the very start when he finished asking the question. Now, that's why my colleague was a bit...
The member will resume his seat. I have been relatively lenient in light of the way... Order! The member is very likely to be leaving the chamber and joining his colleague. I've been relatively lenient with questions coming from New Zealand First today, but when they ask a lot... Order! If the member does interject while I'm on my feet again, he will be asked to leave. I've been relatively lenient, but when a question was as long as that, it is very difficult for me to actually decipher the specific of the question, and therefore I ruled that the minister had addressed the question. Mr O'Rourke took exception to that. I warned him if he continued to relitigate a decision I've made, then he would be asked to leave the chamber. He then immediately did relitigate the question I'd made. If it's a fresh point of order...
It's a fresh point of order.
No, the member will also resume his seat. Now, I've ruled on that matter. If the member's going to raise a fresh point of order, but if I consider in any way it's relitigating the decision I've just made, which the member doesn't have to like, but he must accept, if it is in any attempt, I won't hesitate to be asking the member also to leave the chamber. Point of order.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, it is a fresh point of order.
What is it?
And that's why I'm raising it.
Yep.
Because it arises from your comment that you've been lenient to New Zealand First in question time today. As a matter of clarification, could you point out on what occasions, at what time, have you been lenient to us?
That is effectively an allegation of bias. Order. And that is a contempt of this House. The Right Honourable Winston Peters will also leave the chamber. The Right Honourable Winston Peters will immediately leave this chamber. Order! Question number 9, Dr. Palmer.